And I think we already touched quite a bit on what this panel is going to be about, and that is corporate governance and values and the economics of mutuality. And when you talk about corporate governance, I think what is ultimately quite interesting to analyze is corporate behavior. Okay? But what is corporate behavior? You have got the corporate, and that is the structure, that's the business. And you have behavior, and that's the people. That is the life force of a corporation. And the people, that is you, that is me. We've heard it in the panel. Our accountability, our decisions, our free choice. The only thing that we really have as humans that distinguishes us from a stone, from a broccoli, from a dog. We have free choice. And how do we engage it? And this is exactly what then will create leadership, which then can be a concept of corporate governance driven by fundamental values. And this is what we would like to talk about and to see whether things like VW scandal, the Enron scandal, the Deepwater Horizon scandal could be avoided if we have something in place that really incorporates the economics of mutuality at that top level. So it is a question about top to bottom and the transpiration of our values. For that, again, a fantastic panel we got together, starting with Dr. Kluge. Jürgen Kluge, join me on stage, please. He's the chairman of the board, Foundation, Lindau Nobel Laureate meetings. I have to read this out, this is so long. Member of the council, Lindau Nobel Laureate, and now you're doing your own thing. That is really...
I stand behind you.
You can't see him, right? This is everybody wanting to stand behind me. Anyway. So, 25 years from McKinsey. So you know the corporates inside out. You go into corporates, or you went into corporates, you analyze them, you told them what was wrong. So you give consultancy. Then you went to a fantastic company, Haniel. Does anybody know Haniel? German corporation, private company. A very old one, 4 billion euros worth of a company as a CEO, as their leader. And what really impressed me there is they actually have the value, the main value, and that is honorable businessman. And you're now independent as a consultant. So thanks very much for being here. Now, mutuality, corporate governance, how much did that actually really, play a role when you were with McKinsey? How much did it play a role when you were a leader with Haniel? And should it play a role if it wasn't that much of a role?
Frankly, it becomes increasingly difficult to add new things. Everything seems to be said, but not yet by everybody. So I will add a little thing.
You can add value, I'm sure.
To it. I'm trained as a PhD in physics, so I tend to look for the pattern behind the sometimes complex and chaotic behavior. And that was my value proposition when I applied for McKinsey, to bring a rational approach to business. I still have my application letter, and it was one of the phrases I used. Let me make three tiny little points. From time to time, it's good to look into other faculties and other textbooks. So you could go for the textbooks in mathematics and game theory. So what is business? You could either play cooperative games, working together. The two of us solving a jigsaw puzzle. I'm working on the sky and you are working on the bottom of the picture, and you find a blue stone and you hand it over to me and I use it for my sky and we are both fine. And there is a second sort of games, non-cooperative games. Poker is one. It works nicely and you can play it with gangsters and crooks, but what you need is very tough rules. You have to enforce it to the point that you shoot the other guy if he is betraying you. Business is a cooperative game. You see people twice in life, even more often. And in an interconnected world, increasingly interconnected world, it's becoming increasingly cooperative. So you have to search for win-win solutions. So that's the basic foundation of what we talk here about. The second thing, second point, beware of false trade-offs. Some 20 years ago, Toyota was outperforming everybody in operations, building cars 35% cheaper and better and more reliable and more long-lasting and what have you. In those days, we believed that time being faster, quality being better, and cost are trade-offs. But in the end, they proved that they are not trade-offs. So shy away from those false trade-offs, false dichotomies, and solve it. Toyota solved it. There is a higher hierarchy driver, it's complexity. If you can reduce complexity or manage complexity, all three dimensions will collapse, and you can be faster and better and higher quality. And it's called lean production. In a strategic sense, we have the same triangle, and it's called people, profit, and planet. And it's a false trade-off again. If you collapse them, and the driver for that is the value system. It all depends on the values of the leader. Second point. Third point, when you search for solutions, any problem, they might be difficult. But finding a solution space and the shape of the solution might be the first step. So we had that. What is a good profit? Actually, zero profit, not sustainable for many reasons. 100% profit or even more, we had that when Porsche tried to acquire Volkswagen. They had a year where the profit was higher than the revenue because of the share gains of their already bought Volkswagen shares. Not a good solution. So the solution shape, the utility curve has that shape. So there is an optimum in the middle, and you can find it when you discuss it. But there are other problems, and they have a utility curve like that. For example, the refugee problem is a problem like that. You have to do both. You have to be very caring and integrating people that suffer from war in Syria and other things. On the other hand, you have to be very tough, and who is abusing it has to be prosecuted and torn out. So the solution of that problem is bipolar. And in some cases, you have solutions that have an optimum on one side of the solution space. So start to think before you try to solve a problem about the solution space, and then you find it. A very difficult problem like how high should taxes be? Our political system can solve it very easy because it's that sort of problem. Zero taxes is nothing, 100% taxes, nobody works anymore. And then depending on compromises, you solve, and if you are a socialist, it's 60%, if you're a liberal, 30%, but the political system over time finds the optimum. But when it's really difficult, and there's an old German saying, in Zeiten großer Gefahr und Not bringt der Mittelweg den sicheren Tod. In tough times, the middle course is bringing certain death. That's a poet from the 30 Years' War, from a poet from Silesia. And I guess now the world is at crossroads, and we have to decide. Either you, the younger generation, goes in one direction, that's the future with more modern solutions to our problems, or we retreat to the solutions that failed 100 years ago. And when you see some of the leaders, and it all depends on the values of the leaders, and group them in a box, smart or not, values or not, I'm afraid some are in the box of not very smart and no values. So we tend to select rather the smart ones with values. And in that sense, I'm quite happy with our chancellor.
Oh, wow, okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Kluge. Please, we get into more details. You already see that it's going to be a very complex kind of discussion. Also adding to it is Clara Miller. She's the president of Heron Foundation. And her main goal is, come up to me, Clara, to help people to help themselves. So whilst the foundation, you do not believe in charity. Thanks very much for being here. Now tell us a little bit about what you do at Heron Foundation and the big shift you actually created from the top in terms of how a foundation is being approached.
Sure. So those of you who are familiar with private foundations know that the typical business model is that a wealthy individual gives a large amount of money. It's conventionally invested on one side. And by US law, IRS tax law, 5% is given in gifts to nonprofits, typically. It's been called a hedge fund with a small giving program attached to it because, that's conventional investment. And after the financial crash of 28, Heron said to itself, gosh, we've been doing impact investing for a long time. At that point, 40% of our corpus, as it's called, our endowment, was invested alongside our mission. We said to ourselves, if our mission is to help people help themselves out of poverty, we can't do it with marginal grants or with only some of our assets, or even thinking that our $300 million asset base, which is on a good day, a rounding error on a rounding error on a rounding error of the New York City economy, is going to actually change the world for the people we care about. So we said to ourselves, we have a fiduciary duty of obedience to mission, and that applies to all of our assets. We changed our business model. We said there's no division between the investing side and the giving side. We are a fund altogether, and we are deploying capital for mission to make a change in the world.
And you went all in and basically 100%.
We went all in. As of last December, 100% is aligned with mission. And we still make grants. We continue to do what we did before. It's just the switch has changed. We have changed to say there's not a kind of a terrarium, as we used to call it, a protective place where we make grants to marginal organizations. In fact, it's very inspiring to hear Jean-Christophe because we have a very similar point of view. If we aren't influencing people outside our walls, if we aren't putting ourselves into the economy as an actor and a player, and not as a kind of a protected place away from the bad market that's doing evil, we aren't doing our jobs in philanthropy. Philanthropy is a way of life. It's a form of pushing values out there. We want to have an impact on other investors, and we want to be an investor ourselves, and we do not want to be a special snowflake. We want to be thinking very holistically about our mission.
Absolutely, but that wasn't such an easy switch to introduce that, what you call a combo model, and especially because foundations are also regulated when it comes to taxes, I think. So it must have been quite a rift there.
Well, yes, and no. I mean, I think that once you change your mindset and you say to yourself, actually, tax compliance is not a strategic imperative. Starting out your day saying, gosh, are we going to push 5% out the door and be in compliance with IRS law isn't inspiring. And if you're a charitable foundation, it's not a very good way to be starting your day. So we said, we're going to be like a normal business. We're actually going to comply with taxes, but it's, as we go. We aren't worrying about that and have 90% of our 5% payout at the beginning of the year every year, which is very typical of foundations. We're going to think about it holistically. What's the best possibility? What are the best enterprises for doing what we want to do? And what's the best way to get colleagues and other investors into the pool with us?
So the crisis was a circuit breaker of the approach.
Yes, because if our mission is to help people and communities help themselves out of poverty, that crisis was the greatest stripping of assets from the poor in American history. That's what that banking crisis did. So if we were kidding ourselves, even though our community development portfolio performed better than any other asset class in our portfolio at that time, Anybody outside it, which was everybody, had their assets stripped. And that has not come back.
And Clara, we're going to talk about what it actually meant internally to have that switch on the top level a little later on. Thank you so much, Clara. Dr. Lynn Paine. She is John G. McLean Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business. You continue to publish papers over and over and over looking at leadership, corporate governance, and you co-authored a fantastic book really talking about capitalism being in crisis. Can you tell us a little bit about those findings?
Yeah, but first, I noticed my name wasn't up there, so I thought you were releasing me from my obligation of mutuality, but no.
You know what? I'll take responsibility for this. Can we perhaps short-term? Why are you not there? I do apologize in the name of the team. I do apologize. Well,
no, to say a little bit about the book, The Capitalism at Risk. Yeah, so a few years ago, we were coming up on the Harvard Business School's 100th centennial celebration, and a few of us got together to think about what should we do for this celebration. And we decided that instead of looking backwards and celebrating all of our great achievements and that sort of thing, we should be looking forward to the next 100 years. And what we as an institution, what we as educators should be educating our students about. So in typical Harvard Business School fashion, we decided to do some case studies and to go around the world and talk to business leaders. So we put together the case. We then set up discussions with business leaders in Europe, Asia, Latin America, the US. And this, by the way, was before the financial crisis. This was 2007. When we went around the world and we talked to these business leaders, we were surprised because that was the era of what was an irrational exuberance, right? Right before the crisis, we'd found the magic formula and so on. But what our business leaders said to us is that beneath that facade, beneath that surface, there are a lot of brewing problems. Globally, that could threaten to undermine the global market system, that could undo some of the progress that we have made so far, even blow up the system entirely. And it was amazing. Number one on their list was the stability of the financial system. Again, before the financial crisis, people were telling us there's not enough transparency, people don't know what's going on, something bad is going to happen.
They knew but didn't do anything.
Yeah, but that was only number one. We had a list of 10 disruptors, as what we called them, because we saw them, if we don't deal with them, they have the potential to disrupt the whole financial system. And there's no big surprises or secrets here. Everybody knows about these things, from environmental degradation, the growing income inequality, perceptions of corruption, inadequate public health and public education. We have the list of 10 there. But that book then got us really thinking about these challenges, because in order to address those challenges, we need to come back and talk about who's going to do it, who's going to do what's the role of business, what's the role of government, and so on.
In those discussions, did you actually ever get a feeling that they not only knew and decided not to whistleblow, but that they actually took on that responsibility? Did you see?
Well, we did. It was very interesting. Talking to these business leaders, when we got to the question of who should do what, our business leaders kind of fell into 4 groups. We had some who had sort of a classical neo-economist view, which is neoclassical economist view, which is, look, these are public goods problems. They should be taken care of by government. We're business. It's above our pay grade. What really should happen is that business should get out of this business and let government do its job. So we had that group. Then we had another group who said, no, business needs to be an activist for good government. Yes, these are public goods problems, and government needs to take responsibility and do something, but we as business need to encourage, support, help, generate ideas.
Okay.
Then we had another group, the third group, who said, actually, these problems are problems that can't be solved by government, because there's a lot of problems with short-termism. Governments are stretched financially, politically. You take the US, mired in partisanship. I mean, there's so many challenges for government that none of these problems are going to get solved unless business takes some responsibility in its own operations and to begin to do the kinds of things we're talking about here, which is innovating in your business models and in your technologies and how you do things. So we had that group. And then, of course, we had the group we've heard about here, which is the business as usual group. And this is so interesting to me because there was this business as usual group who were very optimistic about, oh, yeah, we've got problems, but the system will fix them because the system always does. But they're very pessimistic about anybody actually doing something in the system, right? The thought was, well, you know, whenever you try to engineer these changes, you always get unexpected consequences. And so, but what we took away from all of this, even though we had these 4 different groups, there was kind of an overall sentiment that business needed to be more involved, and that we as educators needed to help think about how that could happen, either as an activist for good government or innovation in your own businesses. And so we started doing some research on those questions.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that paper that you just released as well, which is a follow-on onto this.
Absolutely. Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, now we're going to come to you. Professor Xiang, thank you very much for joining us from China. He's a founding dean and professor of China Business Globalisation at what is China's first business school. So,
first private business school.
Private business school, absolutely. And you were its dean, and I wonder, when we talked on the phone, which was a great conversation, you said, you know, the Chinese are the most capitalist in the world. It's fantastic.
You have to stop me because when I talk, usually for 3 to 4 hours, 5 minutes not enough. Yes, actually, the reason I come to join this great conference is I think the idea of mutuality is very relevant for China. And then, there are a lot of misconceptions about China. China, yes, we have a strong element of state capitalism, but China succeeded because the adoption of neoliberalism as initiated by Ms. Thatcher and then President Reagan and Ms. Deng Xiaoping embraced much of that. So as of today, the purely private sector, 70% of China's GDP, 80% of jobs, over 90% of new jobs. The 2 most valuable companies in China are Tencent, Alibaba, not China Telecom, not China Mobile, not any of the banks of PetroChina. And if you look at China's welfare, we have virtually nothing. We have no universal health care. Our education system only covers 9th grade. Definitely, we don't have universal pension system, And you look at the Gini coefficient. If you look even the data, 2008, our Gini coefficient was 0.491. Brazil was number 1, 0.52. US was number 3. So in many dimensions, you could consider China, at least maybe or amongst the most capitalist country on earth. So China succeeded because of capitalism. China got herself in deep trouble because too much capitalism.
Mm-hmm. And, so we're talking about
income, wealth, inequality. So and take this mutuality idea to another level. I might argue. I think. For these 2 countries, like China, US, embracing neoliberalism to the limit. And, there may be too much capital, not only in China, but also in the US as well. And in Europe, maybe too much socialism, So I think...
We all get it wrong.
Europe may have difficulty sustaining the competition from these 2 capitalist countries, And so for global good, global balance, maybe we need more elements of socialism in China, that's for sure. Maybe US, I cannot speak for US, but maybe less socialism.
But that's an interesting one, Professor Xiang, because I think to see whether we are actually all on the wrong track, and we have to redefine whatever we think about capitalism and how really to put it into a tighter bracket which works globally, considering we are operating globally is an important issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So now... Well, as you can see, we have academia, we have foundation, we have consultancy and corporate background here on the panel. And to draw it all together is an interesting challenge. And I think what you just said, Professor Xiang, is important, that each you come from Europe, I come from Europe, the States, Asia. So we also have that globality going. It is difficult because you have different levels of velocity of development of economies, of thinking of values, and to bring it together in a global world and solve global problems is exactly the challenge. So we have two challenges, A, on the individual, and B, on the individual systems. So who would like to pick up the first question I have? How do you tackle a problem like this as a business on the level of, okay, creating corporate governance with that mutuality hat on?
Let me give it a first shot. There's a second principle that is competition. And it really fits as well and is one of the drivers of our progress for human mankind. And we shouldn't forget that. And if you have the superior mental model, you will be able to have better results. And what we see right now is a competition in a changing world for the better philosophy and understanding of what is going on. And who gives the better answer will have the leading edge. And then we will see a convergence to that model. And then the next huge disruption will happen. And then the game starts all over again. And it is in a context. Obviously, Europe is in the context of Immanuel Kant, who basically said, don't do to me, don't do to others what you don't like done to yourself. No, he said, in everything you do, you should have the idea that it could be a general standard. That's what we have in Europe as a backbone in that debate. China comes from a different culture. I don't want to dwell in that, but the great thinker Confucius made great points. You might elaborate on that. And in my view, the US comes from a pioneering background where you test things, where you simply go forward and see the result and then evaluate it, and that is much braver in some kind, much faster, and in some kinds a little bit dangerous, a little bit more dangerous. But that's pragmatism. Yeah. So it's in a context. But we shouldn't forget that there are two principles. One is friendly competition, not unfair competition, friendly competition on a level playing field that brings progress into the world, then convergence, and then starting to go to the new paradigm.
Well, let me pick up on that level playing field, but we don't have a level playing field. We have a global economy where we don't have a level playing field. Isn't that exactly the problem?
Well, the notion from Confucius is you need a diversity to be harmonious. That's a fundamentally different from end of history argument, you know. And then when Secretary Hillary Clinton said, you know, this diversity should be celebrated, U.S. did that well, does that well. But when you go outside of the U.S., you tend to want to be homogeneous. You know, that's the problem for me. You know, I think for the future, especially today so globalized, so this diversity should be celebrated. The first time I went to Moscow, and in 2006, and then I was really struck by the slow pace of life. In China, time is money. We do everything the fast way. We have no tolerance for anything, you know. And then there, you know, time is unlimited in Moscow, you know. And then we commercialize everything. We put even advertising in the lift. You go to subway in Moscow, no advertising. So I thought, oh my God, you know, this group of people, they really live differently. Maybe that's the reason why they really contribute so much in science, in literature, in arts, great ballet dancers, and a high school math teacher spending years calculating the orbits for synchronized satellite. Our math teacher, even he is so good. If making no money, this person has no interest. You know, so I think today it's just so globalized. We need to promote a different system, a different way of living. So that could be essential for different talents for emerge, for civilization to advance. We have too much talking finance, economics, very little coverage of civilization. That's the problem I have. Even I'm the dean of the business school. I have concern for that as well. Yes.
Then could I just push back a little bit on this diversity theme in a sense, which is a few years ago, actually it was now 20 years ago, I developed a course on managing across cultures. And I used Samuel Huntington's framework to identify the different cultures of the world. And I decided to go to these different parts of the world and write cases about admired companies, in each indigenous companies that were admired in each of those. And this is only quasi-scientific, right? But my impression from that exercise was that there were some very strong similarities among the outstanding, highly admired companies in all these cultures. But if you looked at the kind of mediocre companies, there were a lot of differences. But the ones that were really outstanding had very similar principles about how they operated. So that intrigued me and led me to do a research project with some of my colleagues who know about things that I don't know about, like doing surveys and statistical analysis and so on. And we created what we called a codex, which was a set of what appeared to be, based on the research that we did, sort of common principles of conduct among these different cultures, for business, that is, corporate conduct for business. And we took that survey and made it into an online instrument, and we put it into 10 languages. We worked with 4 multinational companies based in Asia, US, and Europe, and we asked 2 questions. So we took the standards, put them in the survey, asked for each standard 2 questions. Is this something you think companies should do? Second question is, to what extent does your company actually do it? And we found a striking consensus among the people about what they thought companies should do. Where we found the variation was around what they actually did. So we called this kind of the conduct gap. And then we plotted the answers, and you get some very interesting information about sub-parts of your organization where people agree on what they should do, but actually don't do it, or where they don't agree on what they should do and they don't do it. So this notion, I think we have to be really careful about assuming from what we see around us that that's what people think they should be doing. We really have to go more
Absolutely,
deeply.
but this gap, where did that come from? Why didn't people put the money where their mouth is?
Well,
if the value was there, it seems.
Well, we then, so let me just say that we had about 6,000 respondents to this survey from these 4 organizations. They were meant to be representative of the organizations, and I think there was about 23 countries represented and so on. And we were able to look at organizations as a whole, the whole sample, subparts of the organization. So where did the contact gap come from? So we looked at that from the external context, and of course, there was more of a gap between shoulds and actuals in poorer countries, where their rule of law is less well developed. Mm-hmm. And so we only, in a sense, sort of reinforced what everybody thought in advance. But I think if I were taking this, and some of the companies that we worked with wanted us to continue doing this, but we're not a consulting firm, so this was for research. But looking then at the culture of the organization, the incentives in the organization, all the things that we've been talking about here are the things that make the gap wider or make it narrower. But we had, I think we need to do, companies, leaders need to do more about diagnosing what's going on inside the organization so they can identify these gap areas and then figure out how do we narrow that gap.
Absolutely, and let me refer that to you, Clara, and exactly that change you made with Heron. And then you had to go through all your assets and actually see whether you had corporations in that portfolio which had that gap, which maybe had great ideas, but weren't putting them into practice or didn't have either of it.
Yeah, well,
and kick them out.
Interestingly, we have one of our battle cries at Heron is accounting is destiny. or maybe accountability is destiny would be a better way to put it. Once you say to yourself as an investor, we're not going to look at the asset class level anymore, which is most of what investors see. Do they have bonds? Do they have stocks? Do they have private equity? We're looking underneath that at the enterprise level and ask the question, well, that's where impact actually happens. That's where people are employed. That's where, rivers get polluted. What's going on there? And the data for environmental is decent. The data for social is appallingly bad. And from our point of view, we're anti-poverty, so we're kind of looking at that in particular. We called it, it's self-reported, it's non-auditable, it's also about intentionality. It's what we called letters from grandma. My chief executive cares about his, my grandson, the chief executive, cares about his workers, signed grandma, and that would be in the file of MSCI. So the gap that we're dealing with, in a way, has to do with the same kind of thing. We all know that these things are good. We want to be in the ESG positive pile. But the reality of actually making it happen year to year, day to day, it's going to take systems for investors. It's going to take work and culture change at the enterprise level, which is not going to be easy.
Easy.
I guess it's all true, but in the end it's even worse. It needs culture change and mindset change in the individual. It's the single person sitting here in the room taking the decision day to day, and they are either good or bad. An anecdote. When I was at McKinsey and the Enron case was lingering around, so it's a while ago, I asked a very young researcher a question. Why are companies disappearing, going bankrupt? So it's not the bicycle manufacturer that is bought from another company and then again manufactures bicycles. That's not the case. Really going bankrupt, what is the reason? Disappearing from the marketplace. So bad operations, cost too high. No. 10% of the cases, usually you fix it and you go to a valley, and after 5 years, company is fine again with the help of McKinsey or not. So everything okay. 20 to 30% wrong strategy. That occurs sometimes. When you are in businesses where you have to heftily invest and you choose the wrong point to invest, you can't correct it anymore. But a wrong strategy can be corrected in 5 years. Usually in basic material industries, it might be different. So there is a group of companies that go away because the strategy was wrong. In over 50% of the cases, and it was a back-of-the-envelope analysis of a young guy, and I said, take 100 cases, and then we went for 1,000 cases, same result. Take 100 cases worldwide. It was wrong behavior, moral wrong behavior of one guy or a small group of people. That's the reason. And there you have to tackle it. It's a segment of one problem, and you have to eliminate those guys that do that, weed them out, and you have to promote the guys that have the values. And after 20, 30 years and being in charge to find CEOs as a member of supervisory boards, yes, you go for the smart guys, and when you are young, you value that very highly. When you get older, you value the values of the people you hire even a little bit higher. So if the guy is 90% smart, but 100% value, I would go for him.
So integrity is hugely important.
Is the key point, and that starts with you. You can't complain about the environment, but buy a ticket for $20 to fly from Heathrow to Spain. If you do that, you are compromising everything. It's simply not possible. You can't be for animal protection than go into the supermarket and buy a steak for 99 cents. So don't do those things. It's your decision. And when you are in a leadership position, try to multiply it out.
Yeah, and I think, Professor Xiang, you as in your position, you're having those future leaders that will make these decisions.
Well, actually, we'll be 15 years old by end of November. And then when we, the beginning of figuring out a business model, a strategy for the school, we didn't look at the business school as like, we don't want to be copycat. We look at some of the economic, social issues, and we think about in what way we can contribute. We see the case of China. Entrepreneurship, very important, but entrepreneur usually, because many reasons, entrepreneur may take, let's say, 60, 70% of total rents created, leave the balance 30% to be shared by 200,000 employees. So the inequality is created first place, And then as a business school, we cannot change the political system. We cannot change this economic system. So what we did was we started from the top, the chairman, the CEOs. We're probably the first business to concentrate on chairman, CEO. We want to change the way they think. How did we do that? We brought humanities, history, religion, philosophy, 3 subjects, into the curriculum, degree, non-degree program. Because we want them to be competitive, but they want to compete with compassion and sympathy. And as a business, we could not change the political system, our system, And secondly, we see a collective misjudgment. Many leaders I see, for example, a political economic system, will virtually have low long-term consideration, any sort. Political system, 10 years in China, 5-year term. US, 4 years term, twice, 2 terms, 8 years. Finance, present value, discounted cash flow. We turn out a group after another group, really myopic investors. We have so much technology. We're so myopic. We dig a big hole for ourselves, So I think having this sense of humanity in the heart of this, some of the top business leaders may help some of them, not all of them, because I have to stay competitive, I have to make the money, I have the quarterly earning, all stuff like that. Some of them have transformed because they have different way of looking at business. They want to leave their fingerprints, maybe 50, 100, 200 years later. They want to be positive, some. So that's the thing we did as a business school. I think it's something we can do as a business school, as an individual. Started with a leader. We could be snobbish in that regard. But we think, the chairman, CEO, they have a lot of financial resources, they have a lot of leverage. That's probably the best starting point to make a huge change.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So to bring back the humanity into the business school, it's not all just about metrics, which I think is a very important point because it's an important point in yesterday's discussion over and over again. But Lynn, I would like to get to the paper you just published as well, which was very interesting in terms of, mutuality and corporate governance and values, and the gap you really see, how difficult it is, especially between companies that are private, it's easier, and those that are publicly traded companies, hostage, it seems, to investors.
Yeah, I'd love to say a little bit about that paper because it really builds on what you were saying, Jürgen, about the mental model that you have, and builds on what you were saying about short-termism, and builds on everything that you've been saying about closing the gap. Because after we did this book that I mentioned earlier, we started going on a search for looking for companies that were making significant investments in the kinds of innovations that we really need to tackle some of these problems. And we were looking for significant investments. So the kinds of things like GE's investment in eco-imagination, $15 billion there. Nike's efforts to create a waterless dyeing technology. They dye a lot of fabric, a lot of water is used in that. They were looking for waterless dyeing. We actually looked at China Mobile's whole digital effort to bring smartphones to Western China and empower the rural poor. Lots of money going into creating a new distribution system. But we got to the point where we weren't finding many of these examples. We were finding a lot of people talking about sustainability, but most of this was sort of small, incremental investments to make things a little more efficient. So, we use a little less water. Nike said, we don't want to use any water. So this was we were just finding that there was not as much innovation as we thought we needed or hoped to find. And so we started asking why. Well, we kept getting some version of my investors won't let me, I have to think about my shareholders, my board won't let me. And we also noticed that a lot of our examples had some way, and Colin, this goes to a point you made yesterday, they had some way of shielding themselves from the short-term pressures of the market. And I'll just give the Nike example really quickly. Take Nike. It's a publicly traded company, but there's a controlling shareholder in Phil Knight, and they have dual-class shares, which gets them the worst corporate governance rating you can imagine every single year. So they also have a corporate responsibility committee on which the chairman of the board and the CEO has sat for 15 years. But even with all of that, they had to set up a special part of the organization to invest in these kinds of innovations. And it was under the special stewardship of the CFO, because he said this whole model is so inconsistent with what a publicly traded company is supposed to be doing that we have to protect it. We have to put the shield around it. So this led us to go to think hard about corporate governance and the prevailing model of good governance. And this article that we just wrote is saying, look, if we really want companies to make significant investments in these things, we've got to start thinking differently about good governance. What is good governance? And in the article, we kind of challenge the prevailing notion of good governance and this thing that's taught in many business schools. I don't know if it's taught here, because I don't know, but it's certainly taught in a lot of US business schools, which is that the manager is the agent of the shareholder and derives his right to manage from the shareholder, who is the principal and the owner of the corporation. The manager is therefore obliged to do what the shareholder wants, and it is assumed that the shareholder wants maximum returns for him or her.
Only, yes.
Only. That's the one metric called TSR, in case you haven't heard of it. It's talk about metrics. I haven't heard TSR for this whole conference, but that's the metric that is being used. So we really have to look at that. So this article, I won't go on, but it
No, you should, because you should
this.
juxtapose with your idea to just shift, and where you shift to the
well, yes.
company-based
Well, I will
model.
go on then.
Sorry, no, it's interesting.
Just briefly. So in the article, we argue for a shift to a more company-centered model of governance. And that is to say that managers, yes, are accountable to shareholders, but they're accountable for the health and the ongoing wealth-creating capacity of the company. That's what they're supposed to be maintaining. And so returns for shareholders can't be the only metric in that kind of a system. So in the article, we try to parse, what's wrong with the prevailing model, both conceptually but in practice. I mean, one of the big challenges in the US now is that we have a number of activist hedge funds who purposely buy up shares in companies in order to shift the strategy, shift the financing, raise the leverage, cut the research, cut the investment in people to drive up the share price and then move away. So I call these drive-by shareholders. They come in, drive up the share price, and then say goodbye. And this is, you may say, well, there are not that many companies that have that. The problem is not the companies in which this occurs. It's the fact that now directors of companies, of all the other companies, say that what we need to do is to become more activists than the activists so that we preempt the activism, and so we do all the cutting first. So
it is about accountability at the end of the day.
At the end of the day, so the question
Who
here
does the leadership feel
is
accountable
exactly, there is no accountability for the shareholders who do that.
Yes.
And this is one of the things that somehow we have overlooked for a long time. And this should not become a debate about hedge funds, because I know that sometimes hedge fund activists do good things, and they shake up lazy management and boards that aren't doing their job. But the question is accountability. So when you come in and when you do this to a company, what is your accountability to the third parties who are affected? What is your accountability to the larger public?
Yeah.
What is your accountability for cutting all of this research? So
to make that really concrete, my good friend Klaus Kleinfeld, CEO of Iconic, just lost his job because Mr. Spitzer from Elliott came in as one of the shareholders with a 10 to 15% share in Arconic. Arconic is the higher value add part of the old Alcoa. And the methods were quite ugly, so searching, for example, in the garbage cans of the CEO to find something that you could use to drive him out of his thing. Coming back to, it's all about values, and if you drive that to the extreme, total shareholder return driven to the extreme, not a sustainable model, because the solution of a sustainable company takes many stakeholders into account. So if you go to the extreme, this nice correlation between cost, time, and quality, or people, planet, and profit breaks down. If you have to deliver a spare part to a Formula One race, and it has to be fast for the next Sunday race, you don't care about cost. It's the helicopter and the air freight and so forth. So it breaks down. So if you go to the extremes and push it too hard, you will suffer in the end. And that has happened, and the whole concept of total shareholder return is, in my view, flawed, because it tends to push that to the extremes. You tend to become even more aggressive, and then you leave back in the dark your people, the environment, the future, the research, and whatever. So that has to be rethought in the US especially. In Europe, I live in an environment where I'm the chair of it. We have the two-tier system. I'm the chair of supervisory boards, and that is co-determined. So I have 6 people from the trade unions and 6 people that represent the shareholders. And if it's a tie, I have a double vote, so I can resolve conflicts. That's our model. And there the people with their representatives of trade unions and labor representatives are already in the debate. It's not easy, it's not fast, but in the end, some of the compromises that have to be made are made up front. You could argue whether that's superior or not, but it's a different model.
Yeah.
Professor Xiang.
Actually, our experience is this. In China, a lot of wealthy people, they have their private companies, so they're not under the gun of this, the stock market analyst or whatever. I think value is very important, but when you give them a long-term view, they look at things differently. And for example, if you talk about technology innovation, I said, this is great. Don't just talk to me about how much money you have made from this whole undertaking. Think about the 3 major social issues you can contribute, whether income, wealth, inequality, diminishing social mobility, sustainability. Tell me what you can do with that technology innovations, and with your own private money as well. So we enlarge the perspective, and we ask them to look at issue really long-term, not all of them, but some. And we're happy. No system is bulletproof. Not all the people will make a change. But if you push them, you give a new perspective to look at the issues. Some of them have made positive changes. So we're pleased as a business school. I think we have tried. We help them to
So stepping out of the box.
Yeah, just think a whole new way of thinking about business.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's time to give you the opportunity to get involved in the discussion. Before the gentleman up there. I'm not even off the stage. Wonderful.
From Said Business School. Thank you for the discussion. Yesterday we had lunch with Karim Harji from Purpose Capital, and one of the interesting observations was the profile of investors in impact investment were more becoming women and millennials, which made me think today, as we think about corporate governance, what is the role of board composition in business mutuality and the performance on the company on that side? We've seen a lot of research about relating board composition with CEO compensation, for example, or monitoring the performance, the financial performance of corporations. But how is board composition affecting the direction of companies in terms of business mutuality in general? Maybe Professor Paine have seen some research on that or observations? Thank you.
Well, I can't really speak to any research on that. I could speak more from observations, but I think that the most important thing is how the people on the board think of their role and their objective, the governing objective that they're trying to achieve. And this kind of brings us back to, if you think that your objective is to maximize your returns to your shareholders, you're going to go in a certain way. If you think that your objective is to maintain the wealth-creating potential of the company, then you'll make decisions in a different way. Speaking only now from observation and having been on public company boards, I can't tell you what goes on when women aren't there, because I wasn't there, but when I am there, I observe that we have very good discussions of different perspectives. And so I can only believe that diversity in the boardroom has the same beneficial effects that it has in the classroom or in any other setting, as to help us see around problems, different sides of problems, and so on. So I'm all in favor of all kinds of diversity. I mean, we talk a lot about gender diversity these days, but you also need thought diversity, experience diversity, expertise diversity.
I would completely agree and mirror that. The mirror of mutuality is diversity in the boards. And there is research on it. It's old research and not geared to boards. It was done in the 50s and 60s by the US Navy. And in those days, submerged submarines could launch the nuclear rockets because they didn't have a contact. The technology wasn't yet there, that the president could basically give the code. So 8 officers in that submerged submarine could launch a nuclear rocket. A huge decision to do that or not to do it. And the research was done in groups of people of 8, and if they are all 8 Navy-educated middle class with 2 kids out of, let's say, Montana, they tend to do the same decision. So having 8 people with 8 keys opposite of each other that they can't influence them, if they come from the same background, they tend to have the same worldview, they do the same decision. So you could rather go with 2, get the same decision. If you have one single or even gay or Afro-American among that group in those days, the decisions became much more balanced and better. You might dig it out. It was classified in those days because seen as a competitive advantage, but there is research that diverse groups take better decisions.
There's some research that shows that companies with women on their boards, public companies, do better financially.
Well, I've seen that research.
Oh,
and
it's not so great.
Hey.
I'm not so thrilled with it as
No.
research. But, yeah.
It's a correlation.
Yeah.
It's not
causation.
a causality. It's a huge correlation, and McKinsey
They're feeling
ladies
good
have
and they do
driven
something
that
outrageous.
research, and they sell it worldwide. And I said, girls, hey, it's correlation. They are better companies. They are more open-minded. Then they have more women, and therefore they perform better.
Yeah.
It's huge correlation, but not causality, most probably.
Whatever.
My 2 cents on the question. I was actually I was the launch keynote for FT3 conferences in New York City, San Francisco, and then Hong Kong. And this usually the participant 50, 60 board members, a leading company, U.S. and then Hong Kong region. This is last year, actually, the data are fairly new. So the feedback from the participants was the 2 issues, highest priority for board. Number 1, cybersecurity. Number 2, China. China is so important on the agenda, they have no board representation in China. So those are the 2 issues last year. I mean, across, conference, Sydney or India or whatever, So but definitely the idea of mutuality not high. An agenda, something we should push But, I mean, I'm serving on the board of many companies, including 2 Fortune 500 companies, United Way, Global Board of Trust in the US. So I was privileged. But, it takes individual board members to champion. If you push a little bit, chairman and a chairwoman listens, sometimes. So it's our individuality. I mean, yes, you have your voice. You have to push. Sometimes you just keep on pushing, Sometimes you get it. Sometimes you don't,
But you make a really good point. If the person who's chairing the board is not open to what people are saying, you're not going to get anywhere, no matter who's on the board. But if you, and people have to be willing to push, as you said.
But it's good always try to push,
Okay, let's push the next answer.
John Mellor. Lynn, I much enjoyed your contribution. And I think you're asking a fundamental question about the governance model. Obviously, you're questioning the governance model. And I suspect you're also questioning the legal framework which underpins the governance model. I should declare that I'm a simple banker. I spent a long time in the field of governance. I was with Citigroup, so I have a little understanding of what goes on in the United States, and you can't be involved in governance without understanding the model in Europe, the model in the United States, and indeed around the world. Now, in the UK, the Companies Act was adjusted to actually address this very issue, i.e. that boards should take into account things other than just the interest of shareholders, including the interest of employees, for instance. Now, this is, and people no doubt in this room will know of this section, the Companies Act, section 172. It sounds like the answer. But in point of fact, of course, it's never been tested in a court of law. And until it is tested in a court of law, we shan't really know how effective it is. But I'm just, and you're probably familiar with 172, but I was just merely saying that there have been steps taken here to adjust the model so it doesn't just focus on satisfying shareholders. So my question to you is, to what extent do you think the problem can be solved, i.e. the adjustment of the model through effective law? And I'm looking at you because I suspect you and I are going to come up with the same thoughts about this. If I put my own 2 pennies in, because I don't want to answer it for you, obviously. I don't
Please
think
don't.
the other thank you. Professors tend to be like this, the one I get. I'm also a professor. I suspect there are other issues or angles you'd wish to bring into play, but I leave the question with you. So it's, to what extent can this be addressed by an adjustment to law, and what other issues or considerations would you bring into play to make this adjustment to the governance model, which clearly you're addressing? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think there are things that many different actors need to do apart from the law, although having the legal framework is very, very important. And just to illustrate this, I'm going to get some help from the audience here. After we published this article, I've been getting a lot of emails, some positive, some negative. But one of the emails came to me from a colleague at another, I'm going to answer your question, came to me from a colleague at another business school who said that he had surveyed the second-year students in the MBA program with a very simple survey of true-false questions. And one of the, just to give you a flavor, and this is why I have his notebook with me, he asked them, true or false? An important doctrine of corporate law called the business judgment rule requires directors of public corporations to maximize shareholder value. True or false? Now, the question I want to ask this audience is not whether you think it's true or false, but how many students do you think, what proportion of the students do you think said it was true? It's actually not true. The business judgment rule requires directors to act in the best interests of the corporation. And it's actually more complicated than that, but I won't go into it because it's about judicial restraint. But the question for this audience, and I'm going to give you 3 choices. Was it less than 25%? Was it between 25% and 50%? Or was it more than 50% who thought that that statement was true? So just by a show of hands, how many of you think it was less than 25%? How many of you think it was between 25 and 50? How many think it was over 50%? That's right. That is absolutely right. It was nearly 2/3 thought that statement was true. So now, back to your question. Are there other things that we need to do besides changing the words of the law? In our classrooms, I think we need to do a better job of helping people understand what the actual framework is, right? Okay, then the next thing I think that boards of directors need to talk amongst themselves to think about, like, what is our objective, and then to engage with their investors about what the objective is, which brings us back to the institutional investors again, and sitting down and engaging with them about what we're accountable for. And it brings us back again to us as the ultimate beneficiaries of these investors.
Excellent.
So we're actually trying to work on what is the action plan? What do we really need to do? And obviously, it's on multiple fronts, but I think it's really easy for us in academia. We have to start doing a better job of helping our students.
Just
Thank you.
one additional idea, you could start to talk with your professor colleagues, but even better with chairs of boards and with policymakers, and then we come closer to a solution, most probably.
Perfect, thank you.
Now I'm going to cite research. I realize this is very hazardous with the Harvard professor sitting next to me. But there's research by your colleague, George Seraphim, and it's basically that boards of directors get the shareholders they deserve by acting the way they do, by signaling to their shareholders, we're going to give you, quarter over quarter fabulous dividends, blah, 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 as opposed to we're going to invest in the best interests of the company long term, and we're going to make sure we're the greenest company on earth. Shareholders who don't like those messages can go away. And so there's a lot of opportunity to not play into this narrative and to not be tricked, I think, by this idea that this is somehow law. It's used as an excuse more than it is anything else.
And it is the easy choice because it is the convention, this is how it's done, and everything else is a little bit out of the box and risky on a personal level.
Yeah.
So that is definitely one of the mindsets that has to change. Yeah. Thank you so much. I would love to. We can discuss it later, but as a master of ceremony right now, I have to really stop this panel. Thank you so much. Again, thank you.